fixing my guitars for probably 12, 15 years now, something like that. So I've always heard a lot of really cool stories from Bernie. Going into the Beatles season, this is the pinnacle, as Bernie just said. This is the Babe Ruth of music, okay? And it's important for you guys to understand how important this band is. That this was a 6-year period, in history where they write these albums that will probably never happen again. So that would be really important to launch the season. So not only do we want you guys to try hard and learn songs and get better at them and pick up additional songs, but it's important that you learn why this is so important, why this was such an important movement to this day still is, right? So that's a lot of the reason he is here. Bernie builds guitars. He's what we call a luthier. And Bernie he will tell you, built guitars for George Harrison. So not a lot of people can claim that. You can see a picture of here with him with Paul McCartney, one here with George. So pretty solid. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of introduce yourself the rest of the way. That was the best I could do, but I know you have a much more glorious history than that, so I'll let you do that.
First of all, I'm going to apologize. I'll be coughing every once in a while. I have awful allergies. I'm sorry, okay? And again, my name is Bernie Hamburger. I'm 137 years old. And all of us in this room have something on a particular day in their life that changed their life forever. Whether it's a girl you met, a guy you met, your first electric guitar, the day you got your iPad. Well, for me, it was February 7th, 1964. That's when the United States was introduced to the Beatles on a show called The Ed Sullivan Show. I was a young 13-year-old kid. Before that day, all I cared about was playing baseball and playing with toys. After I saw the Beatles that night as a 13-year-old kid, I said, that's it. I'm going to be a guitar player. This is what I want to do when I grow up. I'm going to do what I can to be a successful musician. So here I am today. I'm not too bad at that. I play in a few different bands here in town. I'm enjoying myself, and till this day, I owe it all to the Beatles, because they're the ones that inspired me so much, the way they wrote their songs and the way they played their guitars and the look and just the vibe they had was like, wow, unlike any other. So I said to all my friends when I was this little 13-year-old brat, I said, I'm going to meet them someday. And if somebody in this room, like one of you guys told the other, I'm going to meet the Beatles. Yeah, sure, right. But I persevered, and the only way I got to meet them was making guitars, But back it up a little bit, I got into guitar and stuff like that. My dad bought me a guitar a week after I saw the Beatles, He says, Bernie, I'm going to get you lessons. After 3 weeks of lessons, the teacher called my dad and says, I need to talk to you. And my father said, why? Is Bernie not doing well? He says, no, I can't take your money. Bernie's showing me how to play Beatles songs.
Oh, wow.
Some people were born with great looks. I was born with a great ear. And so I could listen to a song, play it with no problem. And I was pretty gifted to do that. So one thing led to another. I started getting into these little garage bands as a teenager, played with my friends just like you guys do. And then I got into fixing guitars because I worked on my own because my dad couldn't afford an expensive guitar at the time. He bought a cheap one, but I snuck into his tools and I made it play okay. And then I fixed my friends' guitars, because they were complaining about theirs. And here I am today, still fixing guitars for people. And then I took it a step further in the late 70s and said, well, let me try building something. So I did. And I started the first guitar I ever built, I sold to a band called The Police. You guys ever hear of The Police? Yeah. Andy Summers, the lead guitar player, he bought the very first guitar I ever built. And I'm pretty proud of that. And, when I say build, I don't mean I buy a neck, I buy a body, I put it together. No, I hand carve everything myself from raw wood. And it's just something I love to do. It's a passion of mine. And then
everybody realized I didn't know that.
I didn't
All the
either.
adults in the room are freaking out. Does everybody here have any idea how big the Police are?
I know.
Everybody?
Yeah. You just
well, I knew the adults knew, but maybe some of these folks here might have not been too familiar. But yeah, so that was a thrill. And then about a month later, I made a guitar and I brought it to a concert. This is all back east. I only lived in Vegas since 2000. And my next customer was a heavy metal band called Iron Maiden. And I made the lead guitarist, Dave Murray, I made him a guitar. And it went on and on from there. And then, let's skip I don't want to put you guys to sleep, so we're going to skip a few years. I made a guitar for a country rockabilly guy from the late 50s. His name's Carl Perkins. Anybody in here ever hear of Carl Perkins?
Wow.
I'm very glad. Now, Carl Perkins was to George Harrison what George Harrison and the Beatles are to us. Like, wow, right? So, Carl Perkins and George Harrison were doing whatever. They were doing some tracks or whatever, and George Harrison said to Carl, "That's a nice guitar. I'd like to have that." So Carl said, "You can look at it, but you can't have it." You know, and George said, "Oh, can I buy it?" He goes, "No, I got it from this guy named Bernie Hamburger. And if you want, I'll set you up with him." So Carl Perkins arranged a meeting with me I was flown to London to meet with George Harrison. And I brought an extra guitar with me. And even flying over the ocean, I thought, no way am I going to meet George Harrison. This is, no way, you know. It was too surreal to even pretend it would be real, but it actually happened. And I said to Carl, I said, "Are you sure George is going to come down to meet with me?" You know, because he doesn't know me. And Carl Perkins, with his southern Tennessee accent, said, "Son, if I told George Harrison to jump, he'd say, 'How high, Mr. Perkins, should I jump?'" He really put Carl Perkins on a pedestal, and George was always, in fact, I'll give you a little history. Before the Beatles were famous, even before they had Ringo as a drummer, George Harrison went by the name Carl Harrison. You can research that and see that to be a fact. When he first started getting into guitar, he went by Carl Harrison. That's how much he loved Carl Perkins. So I went to London, and Carl Perkins called George Harrison, and George Harrison took a 60-mile drive from where George Harrison lives to the London hotel where I met with Carl. And George came up, and you know, I'm in a hotel room with Carl. George Harrison and his wife walk in the hotel room, about this big. And George Harrison walks up to me and says, "Hello, Bernie, I'm George." And all I could do is go, "I know." I mean, I couldn't believe this was happening, you know, because it was just too ridiculous. He goes, "I understand you made a guitar, you know, for me." I go, "Yeah, check it out." And it was this guitar right here. It's shaped like a Strat, but it's hollow with 2 F-holes in it. In fact, Carl Perkins took this photograph. And he played it, and he goes, "This is really, really neat. I really like this." He goes, "Would you be interested in letting me buy this from you?" I said, "Absolutely." So he did, and what happened after that was, it was a typical hotel room. There was like a couple of beds and a little bit of furniture. I'm sitting there, and over here is Carl Perkins playing the guitar that I made him in the past, and then George is over here playing the guitar he just took delivery of. And they're both playing these songs like "Honey Don't," and everybody's trying to be my baby, and I'm thinking, can you freaking believe this? Here are these two gods playing guitar with each other on guitars I made them. I said, this is crazy. So anyhow, a little deeper into the evening, George asked me, "Do you make mandolins as well?" I never made a mandolin in my life, but I said, "Absolutely." So, excuse me. So he goes, "Bernie, I have to go to this function at the Hard Rock Cafe." What that was, it was the 20th anniversary of the opening of the first Hard Rock Cafe, which is in London, England. Am I right, Paul? The first Hard Rock, was it in London?
I don't know.
Okay, I figured you might have known that. But anyhow.
I should.
Anyhow, so George Harrison asks me, "Would you like to come along? I'd like to talk to you and, you know, explain to you the details of this mandolin I'd like you to make for me." What am I going to do? Say no? No, there's a TV show I want to watch, George. You just go, "No, of course not." So, you know, I'm walking with George, and then George tells his wife, "Sit in the back. I want Bernie to sit in the front." I'm going, "Jeez, this is ridiculous," you know? George is telling his wife to sit in the back so I could sit in the front seat. So anyhow, we get to this function, and we walk through. It's a red carpet, you know, big gala event, and flash bulbs going off. I was the only multi-nobody in the crowd. You know, there was all these big celebrities and stuff, and so George is sitting with me like 2 or 3 hours and talking to me about this mandolin. So anyhow, I did make him a mandolin, and then then all of a sudden George says, "You know, Bernie, after all these years, I'm so nervous standing next to Carl." Because I have another photo like this of me, George, and Carl Perkins. I should have brought it with me. You know, but when the photo is being taken, George looks at me and he goes, "Bernie, after all these years, I'm so nervous and uneasy standing next to Carl." I wanted to look at George and say, "How do you think I feel standing next to you? You know, you're George Harrison, you're a Beatle." So that was quite a thrill in my life. And then, you know, years went on, and what was cool about George Harrison, every once in a while, he's a regular guy. He'd call me once in a while, "Hey, how's the wife, how's the kids, what's going on? Every Christmas he'd call me, Merry Christmas, and he was just a regular guy, you know. I got to know Paul McCartney a little bit, but I never got any calls from him or anything. He was a little bit different type of personality. I love him, he's great too, but George was a lot more down-to-earth, personable. He was here, he'd be just like you or I or anybody else. That's what I love about him. More than once, he used to tell me, Bernie, I'm like you, I'm a lead guitar player. I was just with the right fellows at the right time. No, you're not just a lead guitar player. You wrote a lot of great stuff, but that's the kind of guy he is and was. You know, and then his wife called me about 6 years ago. You know, as you know, George Harrison's no longer with us. And she said to me, Bernie, there's something you really need to know because George isn't here to tell you. I go, what is it, Olivia? His wife's name is Olivia. She goes, well, just so you know, as we all know, George has many, many instruments. They're all put away in storage, with the exception of 3 of the guitars you made him. Those are the only ones here at the house, and they're all sitting on a stand with the wire running into the amp. Those are the only guitars George played the last few years of his life, and that really made me feel good. He was going to go on tour, to do one more, and I was offered the job, and I accepted. To be his personal assistant and guitar technician on the road for a big world tour, but then he really got a lot sicker, and of course that never happened. But that was quite a part of my life there. I could talk about other subjects if you guys would like the gear they used, or, I mean, it's up to you. I don't want to put it...
I'm back here like, oh,
Yeah,
you're going.
you know,
I can't believe some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Paul McCartney came to the... a few times went to see Love here at the Mirage. Any of you folks seen Love? What a show. Anyhow, I went there. I knew Paul was going to be there with Yoko and a bunch of, and Olivia and Danny Harrison, who's George's son. And I was lucky enough I got to walk in with them, and every time Paul McCartney would see me, even when he played at the Joint, the last time he played there, he looks like I was about from here to you away, and Paul's looking out and he goes, Bernie Hamburger? It was the funniest thing. I go, how you doing, Paul? You know, but you know, he was pretty cool to me, and I got to sit. It was really neat watching Love, and then watching these guys watch Love. That was more of a thrill than watching the show itself. It's like, it was crazy. So that was a lot of fun. The other thing that was really cool when you think about how things were back in the 60s, like today a lot of bands, they'll spend maybe 4 months on the road and they might do 20 shows in that 4 months. In '64, in June, in 19 days, they did 32 shows. That's more than a show a day. I mean, a lot of bands today wouldn't even dream of that, you know, and it's just something unbelievable. And before the Beatles played rock and all that stuff, they started off as a skiffle band. Anybody in here ever hear of skiffle? What it is, it's kind of like a folk meets rockabilly, but it was like a British take on it, just a little bit different. Banjos, the washboard thing, and the upright bass and stuff like that, just kind of folky sounding, you know. And then, interesting story, right around that era of time, George Harrison got kicked out of high school, or junior high, I should say, but would be considered junior. I think he was in 7th or 8th grade, because he wasn't doing his homework, which I don't advise you guys to. You guys do your homework, don't stop. But the thing is, one of his teachers said, John Lennon, you will never make a living playing that terrible guitar. You better stick to your studies. Well, of course, John Lennon made a great living playing guitar, but still, everybody should still stick to their studies. But I thought that was kind of odd, you know, that was kind of a cool story. Anybody, okay, we're all familiar with the Sgt. Pepper album. That's the first album anybody ever did where all the lyrics to the album are actually printed on the sleeve. That was the predecessor. Other bands have done it since, or it'll be like in their liners notes somewhere, but that's the first album that any band ever put all their lyrics on their album cover. And of course you all heard of the White Album. Any idea why it's a White Album? It's a crazy story. Prior to the White Album, there was an album called Yesterday and Today. It was an American release, which was the way they, see, back in the 60s, all the records that came out in this country were the American counterparts of the British ones that we all purchase today. Excuse me, it was called Yesterday and Today. It had We Can Work It Out, it had Day Tripper. The first song on the album was Drive My Car. So anyhow, that album came out, they pulled it from the shelves. Why did they pull it from the shelves? It was called the butcher cover, because all the Beatles were wearing white smocks, like butchers wear, and it looked like they had blood all over them, and it was a bunch of baby dolls, that heads and legs and arms of baby dolls laying all over them. You know, to look like they just destroyed all these little baby dolls and put the blood on them and stuff. You know, today that might pass, because nowadays everything's on the internet, everything's on TV. There's nothing that, you know, we haven't seen or heard. But back then that was like too taboo to do, you know, so the censors got mad. They made the Beatles pull that album and they had to put a new cover out. So they did. It was all clean and they're all just like this, right? So then the Beatles got mad when they put this double album together. They said, you know what, let's not put anything on the cover. The heck with them. Let's just have it white. And it didn't stop sales at all. It still sold more than any double, you know. So that was kind of a funny story. Let's see. And the other cool thing about Beatles, okay, you guys have other albums by other bands, not just Beatles, am I right? You know how you get like 10 or 12 songs on a record? Any band other than the Beatles. It could be maybe 2 or 3 songs that made you buy that CD. The other 7, 8, 9 songs you never play hardly, or you don't at all. You know, there's some bands you might hear half the songs, but you notice with the Beatle records, there isn't one song you want to skip over. It's like, that's why I always considered the Beatles a band that had no such thing as a B-side. Because every time they released a 45, like, for example, Yellow Submarine, that was a big hit. The B-side was Eleanor Rigby. Both are great songs, and to me, they're both an A-side. So it's really funny. Or Day Tripper, the 45, the single. What was the flip side? We Can Work It Out. You know, but back then, a lot of other bands, they'd have a great hit. The other side, what's this? And nobody would ever play it again, you know what I mean? The Beatles were the band of the non-B-sides. You know, and here's a freaky thing. The Beatles really have only been a record-releasing band for maybe 5.5 or 6 years, that's all. You know, 63 to the beginning of 69 or so, that's it. You know, and in that time, they had 13 albums, plus a ton of singles. So, you know, so you figure they recorded and released an average of maybe sometimes 3 albums a year. A lot of bands today, they're lucky if they do an album every 2 years. You know, so these guys, and what the beautiful thing about these guys, they were extremely young. They use 17? Who's 17 here? You? What do you guys? That's how old George was when he played guitar on Love Me Do and stuff like that. I mean, these guys were really, really young. It's amazing. You know, the oldest Beatle was 21 when they were introduced to the United States, and that was John Lennon. Ringo Starr, I should say, because Ringo's 4 months older than John. So, what a monumental group of guys they were, you know, and just, you know, what I love the most about the Beatles, none of you were around. Some of you, your parents weren't even around when the Beatles hit. But look at every generation falls in love with them. How many bands are going to do that? Okay, there's a lot of great bands like Van Halen, U2, some of the 80s band, Poison, you know, Ozzy, all that. But I guarantee in 50 years from now, a lot of those bands won't be listened to, or very seldom by very few people. The Beatles, your grandchildren will listen to Beatles. That's what makes them very unique. So, anybody have any questions or things you want to share or talk about? Or?
No, no questions.
I got one. So I read a book, you know, they went through a whole chapter about like how people get to be really good at things, right? It's a book called Outliers, right? So the 10,000 hours chapter that to be really great at anything, you got to spend 10,000 hours on it, which is basically the equivalent of 5 years of full-time work.
Yes.
And he talked about the Beatles cutting their teeth, working in Berlin, where they're doing 2, 3 shows a night for,
brutal.
you know, 250 something shows a year, whatever the number was.
Mm-hmm.
So my point being, it wasn't that they were just good at what they did, or that they had the silver bullet, they were magically born. They worked at it, and they became that good by working hard. It wasn't that they were born with this magical genetic alteration that made them replaceable. They worked their butts off for, right? So you want to kind of maybe fill in on that? So,
yeah. The papers of lyrics and guitar notes didn't fall out of the sky into their hands, like Paul said. They worked hard as writers. They struggled. They really strived to be great at what they did. And something about the magical combination of those guys, just like you as a human body, you got the 2 arms, you got the 2 legs, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that was the Beatles. They were like one machine, a 4-piece machine that was like unbelievable. It's like almost a divine intervention. Like all 4 of them grew up within a golf course area of each other, you know, and the whole planet. And for them to be what they were, it's just mind-boggling. But like Paul said, they didn't slouch and relax on a lazy chair waiting for songs to come to them. They worked hard at it, and they did have a lot of competition. There were other bands in the shadows like the Rolling Stones who were working hard at the same time, who obviously they're great and successful too. But you know, they were competitors with a lot of these bands. And you know, they, like Paul said, they had to work really hard for almost no money in terrible, crappy conditions, playing in awful, seedy places in Hamburg, Germany, you know, where they were just a side act playing music while, you know, people were looking at other things and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden they got into really good songwriting, and fortunately they met a guy by the name of Brian Epstein, who happened to be their manager, and he was also sometimes nicknamed the Fifth Beatle, and so was George Martin, their producer, nicknamed sometimes the Fifth Beatle. And they really put those guys on the map. And the sad story, there's a sad story involved with Pete Best. He was the drummer, as you know, before Ringo. You know, back in the day, the tale was, he was like the handsomest Beatle, what have you, Pete Best. He was good looking, the girls loved him. Ringo at the time, they didn't think was that great looking. But what happened was, Pete Best did not want to conform. Brian Epstein had this image idea. He says, boys, we're gonna take those leather clothes off you, ditch the leather stuff, the bad boy look. We're going to put you in nice matching suits, and you're going to not slick your hair back anymore. You're going to have this clean hair with the bangs and the Beatle cut, right? And Pete Best was reluctant. He didn't want to do that. He goes, no, that's not cool, man. I'm not going to do that crap, you know. Okay, then you're out. Ringo's in, you know. And then Ringo did it, and wow, here he is, you know. So, and it worked out, you know, because Brian Epstein was a very smart marketing guy, because he wanted to introduce the Beatles to the United States, and he wanted to grab everybody as a fan, whether they're 8 or 80. And how did he do that? He made him look nice with a nice suit and a tie. They stood there and they did their thing. And it was just unbelievable. And like Paul mentioned, you know, great, great writers. They worked hard. They always tried to outdo themselves, which is what all of us in this room constantly need to do, or we're going to stagnate. You know, and that's what keeps you going. You know, you might write a great song today, but you might write a better one in a month from now. And that's what you got to keep doing, you know, and just improve yourself. You know, wow, I'm doing good at the first 5 frets of the guitar. Well, we know there's a lot more frets up here, so we strive to learn all those extra notes, and that's what you got these nice guitar instructors here for, you know, and all that matters. So take it in, and the thing is you got to love it and have fun, because if you don't, you're not going to do good. If you love it, you have fun, you're going to do great. You know, and the other thing, a couple of little minor technical details I want to point out to you. Some of you might find this of interest, some of you might not. Their gear. A lot of times, a lot of those great Beatle recordings, instead of having 2 guys playing electric guitars at the same time, and then you had Paul playing bass, you had Ringo playing drums, John or George, one of them would often play acoustic guitar while the other one played electric. Why? Because it put a nice blend together, a nice combination. Like 8 Days a Week. You hear the nice chime of 8 Days a Week from George Harrison, but you hear that strumming on an acoustic guitar that John Lennon would play. It was kind of undone before that, so that was a pretty big milestone, an innovative thing as far as recording and laying tracks in the studio, mixing an acoustic guitar with an electric guitar. And they would use stuff like flat wound strings. Like on this guitar right here that I built, I always wanted to have a guitar like John Lennon's, and being that I was blessed with a gift to build them, I cloned it, and that's what this is. This is exactly like the guitar John Lennon had. I really went crazy to make sure it was exactly like it, even down to where this word says Bigsby. Between the G and the Y, there was no paint there on John Lennon's. It scratched off or wore off, so I had to do it too. Why? I wanted to be like him, okay? These knobs, they were taken from a German radio because John Lennon liked these kind of knobs instead of the big oven knobs, which were cumbersome to work with. This pickup was disconnected. It was left on there for looks because he didn't like the sound of this pickup. They used flat wound strings. Anybody in here familiar with flat wound strings, any of you students? They're a little different than round wound. They're really smooth to the touch, and they sound a little bit more thuddy. And they don't sound real bright and pristine. Well, that is also part of the charm of the way the guitars sound on those old Beatle records. You know, and that's the guitar that John played, and I feel fine with those kind of strings, and it's a very unique tone. So that, and you know, back in the 60s, believe it or not, when you went to a music store to buy strings, you know how today you can go to Guitar Center, you see a whole wall full of different brands of strings, right? Well, back then, you go in, you get one or two things. You want acoustic strings or you want electric guitar strings. That's it. And electric guitar strings back then were all flat wound. They didn't have these round wound strings like they have today.
I can't find flat wound anyway.
Diodario. And Guitar Center does carry them, but they run out of them once in a while. Because guys like me keep eating them up. But yeah, you can't find them. They're called chromes.
Okay.
Yeah, in case any of you guys want the exact sound of the way their strings sounded, you got to get the flat wound strings. They just sound a little bit different. Let me show you.
Yeah, you don't get that scraping sound, so.
Right. You know, and this is, by the way, this shoulder strap, Vox makes it. This is the John Lennon shoulder strap that he used when, on their first television appearances in this country and when they were on tour. I don't like using it because it's very heavy, but this is the strap that John Lennon, this is like the strap that John Lennon used. You know, and it's pretty neat. But, I mean, you can tell the sound of the flat wounds are different. See how they sound different? But that was John Lennon's tone, you know? It's just weird. You know, they're just different, but they're kind of neat. So I just want to share that with you.
So that's pretty much the same specs, huh?
Yes, and that's the other thing about the John Lennon guitar. It's a very short scale. I mean, look how little it looks next to most guitars. When I first saw the Beatles on TV, I thought, John Lennon is like a big guy, almost fat or something. But no, he just had a very little guitar. It's a very short scale. The frets are real close to one another, a 21-inch scale.
Are those like a dual coil pickup? Yeah? Or are those singles?
No, these are single coil pickups.
Oh, okay.
They're made by Rickenbacker. I got these from John Hoffman, who actually made these pickups for me. He's deceased now. He made the pickups that were on the Beatles guitars back then. I ordered
So
these
he
from
just
him.
copied them.
I said, can you please replicate the way you made the pickups on John's guitar? And he
Cool.
did. So I was very fortunate to get those while I could.
Hey Bernie, can you talk a little bit about the different phases of the Beatles, like start with the suit and tie?
Oh, absolutely.
The Indian look and then the pepper look.
Absolutely.